Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we really try to get to the core truths hidden in complex research. Today, we're diving into, well, it's like a piece of ecological detective work. We're looking at how the global economy um, creates these environmental issues that don't really show up for decades. This deep dive is all about a paper called Socioeconomic Legacy Yields and Invasion Debt. The lead author is Franz Essl, and it's a really important study, trying to figure out the real time lag between when we introduce species somewhere new and when they actually, establish themselves and potentially become problems.
Yeah, and what grabbed me straight away was the hypothesis they were testing. It's quite something. They looked at the current situation, the number of established alien species across 28 European countries, and they asked this really fundamental question. Does this current picture reflect today's economy, let's say around the year 2000? Or, and this is the kicker, is it actually still reflecting what was happening economically a whole century earlier, back around 1900?
That jump back in time is, well, it's everything, isn't it? We sort of know instinctively that modern globalization, industrialization, it's massively accelerated the introduction of non-native species. But like the paper points out, a lot of the really problematic invaders aren't the brand new arrivals. Their history often goes back decades. So this work gives us maybe a slightly unsettling view on just how long these ecological delays, this inertia can be.
Definitely. And to really get into it, we need to unpack the core concept they use. It's called the invasion debt. Put simply, invasion debt refers to that often very long and quite variable time lag. It can be decades. It's the time between when a non-native species gets successfully introduced to a new place and when it finally manages to establish itself. It becomes a permanent self-sustaining part of the local ecosystem.
Right. So it's not just a catchy phrase. It's like an ecological IOU that comes due much later.
Precisely. It's often compared to something maybe more familiar, extinction debt. That's where habitat destruction happens. But the actual extinction of species, dependent on that habitat, might trail behind by years or even decades. Invasion debt is the other side of that coin. The introduction happens first, but the established population, the real impact, follows years later.
And the implication there is, well, it's pretty significant. If this debt is a real phenomenon, it means that even if Europe or anywhere really put in place absolutely perfect biosecurity right now, the effects of all those introductions from, say, the mid to late 20th century, they're still playing out. The ecological seeds were planted back then.
Exactly right. And this study felt necessary because other research, like work by Pyšek and others, had already found these strong links between contemporary things like current GDP, current population density, and the number of alien species we see now. So this paper throws down a challenge. Are those current correlations really the driving force? Or are they just masking a much older, deeper economic legacy?
That's the tension right there. We assumed current activity was the main culprit. So how did they actually set up this historical comparison? I mean, comparing 1900 society with the 2000 digital age. How do you even do that fairly?
Well, they needed a huge amount of data, obviously.
Yeah.
On the biological side, they looked at alien species numbers across 10 major taxonomic groups and across those 28 European countries. It wasn't narrow at all. We're talking vascular plants, fungi, birds, mammals, fish, insects, both terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates.
Yeah.
They wanted a really broad picture of how different types of life respond over time.
Okay, comprehensive on the biology. And what about the socioeconomic side? What numbers did they use to capture human activity back in 1900 versus 2000?
They picked three pretty solid independent indicators. Proxies, really, for introduction effort and how complex the economy was. First, simple human population density. Second, per capita GDP, gross domestic product. And third, the share of exports in GDP. They used exports because getting reliable, comparable import data from 1900 across all those countries is basically impossible. Exports served as a good stand-in for trade intensity. And the goal of their method wasn't really to say it's only 1900 or only 2000. It was to compare the relative strength of those two sets of variables, the historical versus the contemporary, in explaining today's species counts. They used advanced statistical models to do this, specifically linear mixed effects models and something called the Archaic Information Criterion, or AIC, to compare them.
Okay, hold on a sec. AIC. For listeners maybe not swimming in statistics daily, what's that really telling us? Why is it important here?
Right, think of AIC as a very strict judge for statistical models. It scores how well a model explains the data, the goodness of fit. But crucially, it also penalizes models for being overly complex, adding more variables just to get a slightly better fit. AIC doesn't like that. So here, it was used to rigorously ask, Do the 1900 variables or the 2000 variables give us a statistically better and simpler explanation for the current patterns of alien species richness?
Okay, makes sense. So the big reveal, they run the numbers, they compare the hyper-globalized 2000 economy against the colonial era, pre-World War I economy of 1900. Which one explained today's alien species patterns better? Did the modern world finally win out?
The result was really clear-cut and honestly pretty surprising for many. Across all 10 taxonomic groups combined, the models using those socioeconomic indicators from 1900, they provided a much better explanation for current alien species richness patterns than the 2000 indicators did. And we're not talking a small difference here. The gap in those AIC scores between the historical model and the contemporary one was huge. It was over 40.
Let's put that 40 into perspective. That's not just saying 1900 was a little bit better predictor, is it?
Oh, not at all. An AIC difference that large over 40 means the 1900 model wasn't just slightly better. Statistically, it's considered vastly more likely to be the better explanation. The contemporary model, the one based on the year 2000 economy, basically had essentially no support in comparison. Its predictive power just vanished when compared to the historical one.
Wow. That is genuinely startling. It really drives home the idea that the consequences of that huge boom in species introductions, especially post-World War II when global trade just exploded, we're not seeing the full ecological results yet. We're still, in a way, balancing the ecological books from 100 years ago.
That's a good way to put it. It really underlines the reality of that lag time. So the next question becomes, why? Why this delay? Why does it take so long, potentially decades, for a species introduced somewhere new to actually get established?
Yeah, it's obviously not like flipping a switch.
No, it's a whole series of hurdles, biological and environmental, that need time to be overcome. You can kind of break it down into maybe three main parts. First is what ecologists call propagoal pressure. Basically, you need enough introductions happening often enough. You need to get past a critical threshold, enough individuals arriving frequently enough just to overcome bad luck, difficult conditions, demographic randomness in the early stages. Second, assuming they survive initially, they need time to actually build up a stable, reproducing population. And this depends massively on the organism's generation time. Think about it. A species that reproduces slowly, like a big mammal or maybe a long-lived tree, it could take many decades to build up a secure foothold. Whereas, a small insect with multiple generations a year might manage it much faster.
So if the big wave of introductions really peaked mid-century, the slow reproducers might just be hitting that critical population mass now.
Precisely. And then there's a third factor, which is sometimes needed, genetic adaptation. Sometimes the introduced population needs a bit of time for natural selection to favor individuals with slight genetic tweaks that make them better suited to the new climate or resistant to local diseases or whatever. All these things, getting enough individuals there, the time it takes them to reproduce, and potential adaptation, they all stack up. And that's what creates this significant debt we're seeing.
Okay, so the overall picture points strongly to 1900. But the paper did find some interesting wrinkles when they looked at the different types of organisms separately, right? Where was that historical signal the absolute strongest?
Yeah, the historical pattern dominated for most groups, 7 out of 10. That includes things like vascular plants, bryophytes, mosses, and liverworts, fungi, mammals, amphibians, fish, and aquatic invertebrates. For plants and bryophytes especially, the signal from 1900 was incredibly strong. It really shows how those early 20th century trade routes and transport networks fundamentally shaped the non-native flora we see across Europe today.
But there were those three exceptions. Three groups where the contemporary, the 2000s socioeconomic factors actually seemed to correlate better. Which ones were they again?
Those were alien birds, reptiles, and terrestrial insects.
Okay, so why would they be different? Why do birds, reptiles, and insects seem to jump the queue, ecologically speaking?
Well, the most likely explanation comes down to dispersal capacity. How easily can they move around once they arrive? Birds and many insects are obviously highly mobile. They can fly. So once introduced, even in small numbers, they can potentially spread out very quickly over large distances, find suitable patches of habitat much faster than, say, a plant or a fish. This ability to explore likely speeds up the whole naturalization process, effectively shortening that lag time, that debt period. A fish might be stuck in one lake or river system. A plant might need years for its seeds to spread just a few kilometers. A bird could check out 50 potential nesting sites across the country in a week. It's a totally different game.
That makes a lot of sense for birds and insects with flight. But reptiles, they aren't exactly known for migrating hundreds of miles, are they? Why would they fit the modern pattern?
That's where it gets a bit more nuanced. It seems to be a mix of economics and climate. For reptiles, successful establishment is often really tied to climate. They generally need warmer areas, like Mediterranean countries. And many of those specific regions in Europe experienced really rapid economic growth in the second half of the 20th century, much faster than maybe other parts of Europe. So you have this overlap. The areas climatically suitable for reptiles saw their economies boom, more trade, more wealth, more potential introductions. Right around the same time, the global pet trade really took off. So the recent frequent releases from the pet trade hitting areas that were already climatically suitable and were also becoming wealthier. That combination seems to have dramatically shortened the lag time for reptiles, and maybe for some pet trade birds, too.
Interesting. It shows it's not just that trade happens, but what kind of trade and where it's happening.
Exactly. And it helps clarify how economic activity influences invasions in, well, two main ways.
Right. Go on.
We need to separate out propagal pressure from environmental legacies. Propagal pressure is about the introductions themselves, the volume, the frequency. That's linked to things like GDP and imports, the stuff we try to manage with border controls. But the second effect is the environmental legacy. This is more about the long-term cumulative impact of having wealth and dense populations over time. Think about the road networks, the canals built back in the early 1900s. They're still here, acting as corridors for species to spread today. Or think about large-scale habitat loss, fragmentation from development, decades of agricultural intensification. These changes, maybe completed long ago, basically altered the landscape, making it easier for some introduced species to establish later on, when they sort of prep the environment for invaders.
They did touch on a potential caveat, though, about modern biosecurity, didn't they? Like, maybe rich countries today are just better at stopping new introductions, which weakens the link to the 2000 economy.
Yes, they acknowledge that. It's possible that stricter controls in wealthier nations today could mask a contemporary link. However, they also argue that, historically at least, most biosecurity efforts have really focused heavily on obvious agricultural pests or human disease vectors. They probably had much less impact on the huge number of other species, the ornamental plants, the fungi, the invertebrates studied here, that make up the bulk of established alien species. So that effect might be limited for the organisms they looked at.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big message for us, for you listening?
I think the main takeaway has to be this incredible environmental inertia. The footprint of economic activity, of introduction efforts, stretches back at least a century. It means the full ecological consequences of what we're doing today with our current globalized economy probably won't be fully clear until decades from now. We're operating with a massive time delay. Yeah, but it's crucial not to see this as just, doom and gloom or a reason to give up on current efforts. Absolutely not. In the long run, reducing that propagal pressure, better biosecurity, controlling high-risk pathways for specific types of organisms, that's still incredibly important for preventing future problems. We have to stop adding to the debt.
But the study really throws the spotlight on the midterm challenge, doesn't it? Because this invasion debt exists, the actual impact of alien species on ecosystems and economies over the next, say, 20 to 50 years could actually be worse than we currently project, simply because we have this backlog of species already here waiting to really take hold and spread. So policy can't just be about preventing new things from arriving, which is vital long term. It also has to get much more serious about funding and implementing control measures, maybe even eradication, for alien species that are already established in Europe, even the ones not yet officially labeled invasive, but that we know cause problems elsewhere. It's like we need to manage the future consequences that were set in motion in the past. It's a really sobering reminder that managing the environment isn't just about the here and now. It's fundamentally multi-generational. We are, quite literally, dealing with the ecological bills from the first major wave of globalization.
Absolutely. It forces you to think, doesn't it? That the most effective conservation actions we take today might actually be addressing the consequences of economic decisions made back when your great-grandparents were young. That's the real historical debt we're grappling with now.